So let's talk about some deceptive and misdirecting Chaos Space Marines with an overview of how to start Alpha Legion in 40k 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a fun Legion focus, talking through starting an army of one of the many heads of the Hydra, with a discussion of Alpha Legion in 10th edition, going through why you might want to collect the army in the first place, a few options for models and theming, a discussion of their Deceptors Detachment, and finishing up with some ideas to expand the army and an example list. Lots to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up, why might you want to collect Alpha Legion in the first place? In the lore, they've always been one of the legions that stands apart from the rest. The 20th Legion of Space Marines, with their XX Legion numeral being appropriately a double cross. These guys are basically the most secretive and clandestine of the Chaos Space Marine legions, both in the Horus Heresy and after. They seem to be Astartes special forces and work closely with the Emperor in the early days of the Horus Heresy, though seem to declare themselves to the traitors during the Isfahan drop site massacre. Though even to this day, no one's really quite sure where their true loyalties lie. They often act as saboteurs and infiltration specialists for the Chaos Space Marines, that always seem to have more complex objectives and everything leading up to some grand plan. The Alpha Legion certainly rarely engage in direct front-to-front combat if they have an opportunity to do otherwise, often concocting perhaps an overly complex series of strategies to lay the enemy low, including such crafty maneuvers such as taking the heraldry of their foes to infiltrate or wrong-foot other forces, only to reveal themselves when the time is right. Their twin Primarchs, Alpharius and Omegon, are both thought to be slain during the Horus Heresy. Though this being the Alpha Legion, no one's ever quite sure of this. Many a warlord has risen up assuming their mantle, the Hydra having many heads, and when you strike one of them down, it turns out the actual guy who was in charge of the whole thing was an entire battlefield away, pulling the strings from the shadows. Miniatures wise, the Alpha Legion in Warhammer 40k basically uses the large Chaos Space Marine miniature range, one of 40k's oldest and more established factions. Most of the core kits for the Chaos Marines have been redone at least somewhat recently over the past 5 years or so. There are still a few dated models around, such as the Bikers, Huron Blackheart, and maybe some of the vehicles, but the majority of the core range is now in fairly recent plastic. The miniatures tend to be kind of busy, lots of trim, lots of spikes, and not quite as much as a clean aesthetic. If anything, I'd imagine the average Alpha Legion force to go a little bit lighter on this than some. In the Lore and Heresy era models, they're often depicted as a bit more uncluttered, but having some armies have sort of a Hydra scale sort of plating. Unfortunately, there's not a huge amount of support for the individual legions in Warhammer 40k. I feel like Games Workshop should at least get around to releasing some individual characters for the major named legions. They can either dip into Heresy era models to add a bit more flavour for either upgrades or entire character miniatures, or use transfers, or use third-party bits or 3D printed sources to add a bit more flavour. Here are just a few examples from the core Chaos Space Marine range. Alpha Legion often use a good number of cultists as their sort of cat's paws to do their dirty work, and only committing a small amount of forces as needed when the time is right. Otherwise, Chaos Marines have got all sorts of categories of elite infantry, such as this possessed Warp Talon here, plenty of big gun battle tanks, such as this Chaos Vindicator, and plenty of choice of characters, one of the biggest being this Demon Prince. For actual more themed Alpha Legion stuff though, the Horus Heresy range does have a fair few themed miniatures for the Alpha Legion. Unfortunately though, these do tend to be made by Forge World, so are a lot more expensive than Games Workshop miniatures, and cast in Forge World resin, which can be a little bit harder to work with than plastic kits. Having said that, I do really like some of the sculpts for these guys. There's an Alpha Legion Saboteur on the left here, a Praetor in the middle, one of their special characters to the right of him. I quite like their sort of assassin figure with his long-barreled sniper rifle on the right. It'd be pretty cool if he could have some rules for 40k. They do have some themed heads and shoulder pads as well if you want to add a bit of sculpted detail to denote your force a bit more as Alpha Legion. Again, these are Forge World crafted resin bits though, so tend to run a bit expensive, but could be a nice way to scatter a bit of theme amongst the forces. They have a unique Terminator squad as well with the Linnean Terminators. Again, expensive Forge World, but could be used to sub in for the Terminators out of the regular army. I feel like the weapons aren't too far away that they couldn't do the job, even if you can't feel Volkite type stuff in 10th edition rules as written. And they do have a fun sculpt for Alpharius himself. Maybe you could run him in 40k with Abaddon the Despoilers rules or something. Price-wise, Chaos Space Marines don't tend to be too terrible as Warhammer 40k armies go, slightly more elite, so you don't tend to need quite as many models or kits to put on the table to make an army of any given size, though I still wouldn't say they're one of the cheapest armies in the game, maybe not compared with things like Custodes, Standard Space Marines with loads of discounts, or Grey Knights or something. Finally, for gameplay, they use their current rules in Codex Chaos Space Marines, which I think was a book that had really quite a lot of interest when it came out. I still think their core rule is really quite a fun one, with Dark Pacts, being able to risk the blessings of the Dark Gods for either lethal hits or sustained hits whenever they attack, though occasionally you can take mortal wound damage as a result. It means Chaos Space Marines tend to hit particularly hard. They've got good range and melee forces, perhaps classically Chaos Marines tending to skew a bit more towards melee than the Loyalist, though perhaps Alpha Legion themselves are a bit more of a mix, and the Alpha Legion themselves have their own Deceptors Detachment as their themed force for a bunch of infiltration and stratagem shenanigans. You can put lots of troops sneaky into the mid-board at the start of the game, and we'll get onto that in a second. Currently, power-wise, Chaos Space Marines are a bit weaker than most in Warhammer 40k, though people still are winning grand tournaments with them, so it's not just completely out of the running. The actual Alpha Legion Deceptors Detachment is used very rarely in competitive play though. It isn't really considered one of the stronger ones compared with the big damage buffs that you can get out of things like Renegade Raiders or Pack Bound. It still can be quite spooky to play against for some armies though. Overall though, if you want a force of sneaky special operative Chaos Space Marines clad in striking metallic teal armour, the Alpha Legion might be the army for you. When planning an army, there's plenty of research that you can potentially do if you want to, though you can certainly just jump straight in. I say if you're new, it's well worth picking up Codex Chaos Space Marines kind of early. It's got unit profiles, rules, and lore and miniature galleries all from GW. Though particularly for Chaos Space Marine Legions, you can find a huge amount of lore in the Horus Heresy novels. The Alpha Legion do have a few things focusing on them. Chaos Legions definitely tends to be better explored than the majority of factions' lore in 40k. Otherwise, for looking at rules and army building and things, you can use things like Battlescribe, New Recruit, and Warhapedia to mess around with some army lists and see what you'd like in your force. You could proxy models to try them out in game, or try them out on Tabletop Simulator if that's your thing. And of course, there's loads of stuff here on YouTube. I made a Chaos Space Marine Codex overview and a unit tier list. There's massive amounts of stuff on other channels though, battle reports, painting guides, and lore in abundance. Easy just to search Alpha Legion or Chaos Space Marines and have more than enough to go at for a really long time. I would also think about checking out Chaos Space Marine Discords, Facebooks, and subreddits depending on where you get your social media. Basically all the major 40k factions have examples of those and can just be a nice way to follow along with what other collectors are thinking, maybe take in a bit of information by imbibing it, or be a basic place to ask questions to other people who already collect the army. It probably makes sense to have a think about exactly what sort of army you want to get out of this when you have built up a collection. You could think about planning out an army list of 1,000 or 2,000 points as a very rough go towards, so you can see what sort of steps you need to take to get there. Most players typically tend to build at least fairly balanced, picking up units as appeals more to them, and going for a nice mix between things that are effective on the table and you like the look of or the lore of the miniature, or you think fits with the theme. Alpha Legion perhaps tend to be known a bit more for their infantry with their infiltration and sneaky tactics, perhaps a bit more so than big tanks and vehicles smashing down the enemy, or demon-possessed mutants just running at them. I feel like an Alpha Legion force in the lore might use a fair amount of cultists, maybe a fair bit of legionaries and chosen, and then have examples of the majority of the other things, but maybe in a bit more of a supporting role, as opposed to taking centre stage. In the past, maybe they've been a bit known for being a little bit more ranged than melee focused compared with some Chaos Space Marine Legions out there, though they certainly can do both. Otherwise, plenty of options with collecting. You could theme your force to a certain detachment, you don't have to use the Deceptors one. You could even mix it up from game to game, and you could decide if you want to give your own warband a bit of a different personality to the core legion, maybe have them based around one particularly charismatic leader. Do they do things much different to their parent legion? Are they worshipping any particular one chaos deity, though for the most part Alpha Legion tend to be perhaps a bit more secular and not quite as devout as some legions like the World Bearers maybe. I have even seen people do some really fun conversion projects with Alpha Legion, such as doing Primaris Alpha Legion armies, or painting up some models that look like they're half phasing between Alpha Legion and Ultramarine or something to show their deceptive tactics. Also at this sort of point, it's probably worth having a think about paint. Maybe a standard Chaos Space Marine Legionary could be a good place to start if you want to test out a paint scheme for them. They're relatively representative of the faction and have a lot of themes that you'll get on plenty of models, plus aren't one of the single biggest commitments for a miniature to paint up, rather than starting with an HQ choice or a big vehicle or big elite infantry or something. Chaos Space Marines in general tend to have really quite a lot of trim, which can be a little bit problematic to paint. Some have it more than others, like models like the Helldrake, and some miniatures might actually be easier to spray the miniature in the trim colour and then block in the armour plates with the actual colour that you want the main miniature to be. Alpha Legion do have their own fairly distinctive colour, a sort of metallic teal sort of colour. I've seen plenty of people realise that in different ways, sometimes going for metallic effects, sometimes shiny gloss varnishes, or otherwise just going for a bit more of a matte teal approach to painting them. Plenty of options that you can do, and you could think if you're going to add any sort of sculpted themed bits to the army, say 3D printed bits or Games Workshop kits from Horus Heresy or something, and if you want any transfers for Legion iconography. Next up, let's talk about the Deceptors. This one's the themed detachment for the army in Codex Chaos Space Marines, and basically while any Legion can use it technically, this one feels like it's very on theme and has a whole load of things that just go hand in hand with the Alpha Legion. The core rule is called Masters of Misdirection. This one allows you to put a number of legionaries and cultists infiltrating up the board if you'd like to. In say a 2000 point Strike Force game, you could use up to 3 units of legionaries infiltrating up the board and up to 3 units of cultists. It's kind of a big deal, as you could have some fairly godly board control right from the start of the game, get the cultists to mark a load of things for their sticky objectives type rule, and legionaries can genuinely be really quite a big threat just in their own right. Plenty of special weapons, heavy melee weapons, and boosted damage from Dark Pacts and their inbuilt rerolls. It also potentially means that you can have scary characters attached to the legionaries as well, maybe things like Chaos Lords or Masters of Execution, and that can add to the potential danger that you could be doing things like first turn charging with. Huron Blackheart isn't really Alpha Legion, I guess, but you could include him in the army to allow some redeploys, which is pretty big with infiltrating units. Could be an option to convert something suitable an Alpha Legion to represent him, I guess. While infiltrating stuff is an advantage, I'd bear in mind that it can be a bit of a double-edged sword. While it means that you can get lots of stuff onto the midfield objective straight away, it does also mean that if you put loads of stuff up the board, then the opponent's going to be a lot faster at getting towards your models and starting destroying them. It can put a bit more of a first turn advantage into 40k that largely isn't too bad in 10th edition. If you're going second and you've just piled the mid-board full of bodies and the opponent can see lots of things with their most dangerous units, you're probably going to take some massive casualties, and it does mean that infiltrators perhaps have a bit of diminishing returns. It's almost always going to make sense to use at least some things infiltrating, but going absolutely full on spam overboard might not actually be the best way. There might be some tricky decisions to make depending on the exact opponent and the exact terrain that you're playing on. Looking at their stratagems, and first up for 1 CP we've got the Detonator. You can trigger this when you destroy a model with a Deadly Demise ability, and you do so within 18 inches of an Alpha Legion character. They can make that thing automatically trigger Deadly Demise, which against the right army can be kind of massive. Even if you manage to destroy something with a D3 explosion, if the opponent happened to have, say, 4 or 5 of their units within blast range of it, then destroying it and triggering this could be enormous. Certainly scatter mortal wounds, but you could get, say, 10 of them out of one blown up vehicle, which is enormous. Even more so if the vehicle was a D6 explosion like some big ones are. I feel like this stratagem maybe incentivizes having some characters infiltrating into the mid-board, as you might want to do anyway, and then actually having some longer ranged anti-tank firepower to blow up some enemy heavy hitters, which could genuinely matter for this. For 1 CP, there's From All Sides. This one's a sort of charge synergy type one. If you've had other units across the battlefield making charge moves this phase, then the unit that you nominate can get +1 to charge based on each other successful unit that has charged so far, up to a maximum of +3. At least in theory, if you do have a lot of stuff that wants to get into melee, you could be making something like a 6-inch charge out of reserve with Chaos Terminators or something. I feel like this one's definitely potentially very powerful, but also a bit dependent on the exact army that you're fighting and the units that you've taken along. Certainly might require a bit of setup, but if it goes off on something that makes a hard charge into a very easy one, then you've won big. For 1 CP, there's Pick Them Off. You get to reroll hit rolls when shooting against an enemy unit that's below starting strength, and then 4 wound rerolls for an enemy below half strength. I feel like it's not too tricky to be able to trigger the hit rolls part of this, and it could well be worth it for bigger scary shooting things with that, maybe some of the Chaos Gun tanks. It will be kind of rare and situational to trigger the reroll wounds bit though, and it needs to be a unit that's worth shooting enough to bother with the stratagem as well. It does feel like one that's a bit more reliable than some though. Next up, for one command point, there's Coils of Deception, allowing you to fall back and shoot. Definitely a handy one to have access to. Can be quite nice for tanks and vehicles, so they don't have to remain locked in combat with something and fall back and allow the rest of the army to shoot that same unit as well, and not lose their own firepower to do so. For 1 CP, there's Relentless Pursuit. This one allows you to move 6 inches to an enemy unit, removing within 9 inches of your unit, and you've got to do that with an infantry or mounted unit of yours. Reactive moves are just generally great to have, means that you could have, say, a legionary squad that was completely exposed and then just hide them behind terrain when the enemy gets too close, or backpedal from a big charge and make it 6 inches harder. This one's a really powerful stratagem. And finally, for one command point, there's Scrambled Coordinates. You declare this at the start of your reinforcement step, and it prevents enemies from setting up within 12 inches of your nominated unit. Kind of powerful to have this on a pop-up sort of ability. It means that you could just stop the enemy coming in from one area of the map, even if they had something like a 3-inch deep strike special rule. I feel like this one really requires getting in the mind of your opponent though, and correctly predicting what they wanted to do. If you use this and the intended drop site wasn't the place that they were going to put their unit anyway, you've just literally just binned off one command point. And I guess their second best option for deploying their unit has to be significantly worse than the one that you'd be preventing with this. Overall though, definitely a few fun ones. I feel like that Relentless Pursuit one is a particularly nice one for skirmishing with enemies in the midboard. The Detonator one is maybe a little situational, though feels really fun if you can manage to pull that off in a place that matters big. Pick Them Off is at least a fairly reliable shooting thing that just requires you to chip a wound off your target first, and the others could all be helpful situationally. Finally, for the Deceptors, we've got the enhancements. First up, there's Falsehood for 10 points. This one allows you to basically conceal a Chaos Lord somewhere. You put them in reserve, and then in your reinforcement step, you get to swap out a Legionary or Chosen model and put the Lord in that unit. You can't use it to create abnormal combinations of characters, as you can't use it on attached units. It is cheap and keeps the enemy guessing where the Lord will be, but does also cost you a model basically just slain in addition to the 10 points, and it might rob you of the opportunity to use some free stratagems earlier on. I feel like the utility on this one's a bit borderline whether it's worth it. For 10 points, there's the Cursed Fang. An infantry model gets extra AP1 better in melee and also precision. I feel like that's not awful for 10 points. Maybe not super auto-include, but definitely could help a Chaos Lord or Master of Executions hit a bit harder in melee. The precision could occasionally be handy for the Chaos Lord, I guess, too. Shadow Obscuration gives you Stealth and Lone Operative, so you could have something like a Jump Lord running around. Fast-moving Lone Operatives are handy to have, though I feel like they might be competing against Cypher perhaps, who's pretty cool. And then finally, perhaps the most fun and interesting one is Soul Link, which means that an infantry model can trigger this each command phase. You select one non-named infantry character from your army, and then you get to gain their datasheet ability in place of yours. So it could create some weird combos, maybe borrowing extra +1 to wound from a Dark Apostle perhaps, or have something borrow the Chaos Lord's free stratagems and the once per game damage buff, which could be kind of big. I feel like at 5 points for the option as it brings, it's pretty much auto-include, provided you have at least some characters that could make good use of it. Does maybe depend a little bit on that being the case though. Overall, I'd say that one's probably the best of the enhancements. Maybe the Cursed Fang and the Shroud of Obfuscation are both interesting enough. Perhaps Falsehood a little bit on the borderline side. Those sounds incredibly good fun and very Alpha Legion. In general, the Deceptors is definitely a bit more of a fun and fluffy detachment for the most part, or at least it's considered that way on the competitive scene. Not many people have really had any significant tournament success with it since the Chaos Codex came out. I think it just doesn't really have quite as much raw strength as things like Renegade Raiders with moving faster and hitting harder. And as mentioned, the infiltrate thing definitely is useful, but it also can be a bit of a double-edged sword and can make the army a bit more prone to being hit hard first turn. As mentioned though, if you want to flavour your force in any other different way, there's plenty of other detachments that you can go for. There are quite a few nice general purpose ones as well. Again, as mentioned, Renegade Raiders and Pat Ban Zealots tend to be particularly strong, and Soulforged Warpack is alright as well. I feel like the Raiders one would also work pretty well for Alpha Legion, moving fast and taking objectives and things, and nothing to stop you changing between them. Moving on to getting some miniatures on the table though. As for standard Chaos Space Marines, I think for Alpha Legion, I'd be tempted to start with either Combat Patrol Chaos Marines or the Chaos Space Marine Legionaries box set, probably the Kill Team one out of the two. Or that at least unless you're going for a more Heresy era aesthetic Alpha Legion or doing some weird fun Primaris Alpha Legion conversion project. In general, with getting miniatures on the board though, I'd try and build up quickly to a small playable army that you can get some small games in, and prioritise things that might be able to do a bit of heavy damage to enemy heavy hitters and armoured elites, plus anything that you just find particularly compelling for your own army that you like the look or feel of the rules for. This is the Combat Patrol Chaos Space Marines, basically Games Workshop's discount box offering for the Heretic Astartes. In this one you get a Master of Possession, 5 Chaos Possessed, 10 Legionaries and 10 Chaos Cultists. All this one for a price of £100, €130 or 168 US dollars. As discounts go, it's kind of in line with the other ones for 10th edition, around about 27% off getting these exact kits separately. Currently it'll get you 425 points in game, which is one of the better points per dollar ratios that you can get in Chaos Space Marines currently. And in general I'd say that compared with the other combat patrols of 10th edition, Chaos haven't really done too badly. When I did some channel polls and things, this one was rated as one of the best 10th edition ones Games Workshop's come out with so far. For the Alpha Legion, if you're playing Deceptors and things, then certainly the Legionaries and the Cultist mob. They're both really quite handy to have as they fill out roles in the main detachment and do feel kind of on theme for the Alpha Legion as well. Possessed aren't awful, though maybe given the new Codex rules they are a little bit more limited in scope to the things that they can deal damage to best, and the Master of Possession was nerfed a bit in the latest Codex. Overall though, I wouldn't say it's the worst place to start. If you're newer to starting armies in 40k, I'd certainly bear in mind the different places in which you can pick up 40k miniatures. You can buy directly from Games Workshop's own Warhammer web store. That's generally the most reliable, but also the most expensive as well. Typically, if you're going for new plastic miniatures, I'd usually go for either local gaming stores or online discount retailers that typically give the exact same thing, but something like 10 to 20% off depending on where you are around the world. As ever, I do have a bunch of online discount retailers links down in the video description. Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21% off, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10% off, and Wargame Portal in the USA for 15% off. They can all just be quite nice places to save a bit of money versus Games Workshop, and the links do help support the channel a little bit as well if you did choose to buy anything through them that you were picking up anyway. A big thank you to you folks who are using those on the regular. Plenty of other options besides new plastic kits though. You can look at the second-hand market. For eBay and other places the quality can be a bit variable, but can save a whole load of money, plus of course time and effort. And this day and age there's plenty of 3D printed and third-party manufacturers that are trying to make things that are kind of similar to Games Workshop stuff, but different enough to be legally distinct miniatures that they can't copyright strike them. It can be handy for things like Alpha Legion and Chaos Legions in general. Perhaps getting your hands on some themed bits that give you a bit more of the look and feel of the Legion, when Games Workshop hasn't managed to do that particularly well for the 40k range at least. It's easy enough to find a few examples of those out there just by searching for proxies. One example I remember from before is this Scylla Legion from Dakadaka.store. They've got some fun miniatures that could work for themed versions for Alpha Legion, tanks, characters and Terminators and things. Otherwise, for adding Legion theme, Games Workshop also sell a transfer sheet for the Alpha Legion. This one aimed a bit more at Horus Heresy, but it can work pretty much equally well for 40k. It gets you lots of nice Legion symbols, Hydras and Alpha symbols. It is a little bit costly at £23 or 35 US dollars, but should keep you going for quite a while I'd guess. Otherwise, for options to expand the army for Chaos Marines and Alpha Legion in general, one common pick could be something like some Chosen in a Chaos Rhino. They're pretty solid melee specialists, and the Chaos Rhino quite a nice way to get them there. Often being led by a Chaos Lord, and when his buffs go off and they use some free stratagems and things on them, they certainly can be a force to be reckoned with. The Rhino can be a nice battlefield bunker to have them charge out of. Otherwise, there's a few gun tanks that can put in some good heavy fire support, things like the Vindicator, maybe the Predator Destructor with some las cannon sponsons, or a Forge Fiend with ectoplasma cannons. All of those are quite strong fire support right now. And as mentioned, Chaos Lords I think are going to be particularly popular for the Alpha Legion. They work quite well for their infiltrating squads, as well as things like Rhinos and Chosen. Otherwise, some Chaos Terminators could be an option. They get you a fairly good ratio of points provided for the money spent, and they could potentially be an interesting option for using that boosted charges kind of stratagem, getting them to have some easy charges out of reserve. Another interesting Chaos option to mention might be the Warp Forged as well, 2 Obliterators plus a Venom Crawler, usually as a Games Workshop online only product. I'd say the Venom Crawler is usable enough, though the Obliterators are a bit overcosted in the latest codex. Could still be interesting enough to use the reroll hit stratagem on though with Alpha Legion. They're kind of notable as they're some of the most points that you can get out of money spent in the Chaos Space Marine army currently. Finally, for a few more discount set options, the Chaos Marines had the Veterans of the Long War and Dread Talons box sets come out in 2024 when their codex did. These were £140 or $230, though I feel like you'd be kind of hard pushed to find one going for the regular prices that they had. They're currently out of production from Games Workshop, though did offer some fairly good discounts on some nice general purpose miniatures for the army. The Veterans box set had most of the core infantry, and the Dread Talons had basically jump packs, plus cultists and accursed cultists. If you did manage to find either of these going for their regular prices, then it could be a very reasonable way to expand. Though if they've been marked up significantly, then it's probably not really worth the hassle, and you might as well just get the units that you want to get, but buy them through a discount retailer and save the money that way. Otherwise, for one different option for playing Chaos, you could think about the Horus Heresy Age of Darkness box set. This one's aimed at the Heresy version of the game, though basically literally every model in the box set could easily be played in Warhammer 40k. Use the Tactical Marines as Legionaries, use the Spartan as a Land Raider, use the Contemptor as a Hellbrute, the Terminators as Terminators of course, and the characters as Lords or something else. It is really quite a big expensive box at £195 or $315, though in terms of amount of plastic and miniatures for your money you'd be hard pressed to beat that from most other Games Workshop offerings. Plus you should still be able to get it through those discount retailers, so a bit cheaper than this. I feel like the slightly less spiky and less cluttered look does work kind of well for the Alpha Legion, being maybe a bit more subtle and feeling a little bit less depraved cult sort of thing in 40k compared with a feugh of the other legions. Though bear in mind that a few of the models might not translate one-to-one perfectly for 40k. If you want all war gear to load out properly, you might need to do some converting to get some fun extra weapons into those tactical squads. So it might still be an army that needs a little bit more work, but definitely an option that I've seen people make use of. In general, with expanding and adding to an army, there's always loads of scope for just collecting what you like the look of in Warhammer 40k. Rules and things do tend to change over time with balance updates, and in general in 10th edition Games Workshop do seem to have done at least a fairly good job of making most Chaos units at least usable, even if not all of them are top tier competitive standout or whatever. My usual advice would be to get a core of the army together and get some games played with them, get some paint on the miniatures, and then expand outwards from there, adding things in small chunks towards a bigger army. I'd likely have a rough 2,000 point army list at least planned out for where the collection might want to go, but be prepared to change and make adaptations as your experiences go once you actually start to get miniatures on the table. Finally, here's just one rough example of an Alpha Legion themed army list. It's roughly 2,000 points, though not absolutely exact, more for general idea and flavour, and as mentioned 40k's points do change from balance update to balance update anyway. This one's going for Deceptors to be on theme for the Alpha Legion, taking a bunch of things that'll work okay for the detachment, plus a couple of enhancements, plus a bit of general purpose Chaos Fire support to hit the enemy hard from the backfield. To make some pretty maximal use of the detachment rule, there's 3 squads of legionaries, 1 big one and 2 small ones, going heavy on the heavy melee weapons plus melter guns. The big squad might well be joined by a Chaos Lord or Master of Executions. There's a bit of an option as to how you flex them. Some of the other characters riding with the big squad of Chosen in the Chaos Rhino to follow them up as a more elite second wave. One of the Masters of Execution takes Soul Link for stealing the buff of the Chaos Lord for a turn, and one takes the Cursed Fang for a little bit of extra AP and hitting power. There's then one big squad of 20 cultists and 2 units of 10 of them. Between those it means that if it makes sense to, we could absolutely flood the board with loads and loads of infantry if we think that's going to be a problem for the opponent, or if that looks like it's going to be a bad idea we can still deploy a bit more conservatively and have those legionaries be part of the second line. For running around and doing some secondary objectives and actions and things, there's a unit of 5 Raptors that can deep strike, and then 2 units of 3 Chaos Bikers with melter guns and power fists. With all these squads that can skirmish in the mid-board and do a bit of damage up close, I certainly hope to make a bit of use of that reactive move stratagem to hide the unit as the enemy gets too close to them. That could be very frustrating. And then in the backfield we've got a trio of big gun tanks, 1 Vindicator to pop some enemy armour, 1 Predator Destructor with las cannon sponsons, and 1 nice anti-elite Forge Fiend. I'll certainly be on the lookout for any enemy vehicles that could be worth trying to blow up in the midst of the enemy army. Hopefully move a character to within 18 inches of them and then blow them up with the Vindicator or something in the shooting phase, and hopefully cause some nasty damage there. Hopefully it should be an army list that's at least fairly good for objective work, with quite so many Chaos Space Marine bodies, including loads of things that can grab the objectives or take up positions in the mid-board early. Certainly won't enjoy enemies that have their own infiltrators that take up a bit too much mid-board real estate. That could be kind of annoying. I feel like it maybe isn't going to be one of the armies that has the absolute biggest damage output compared with a bunch of Chaos Space Marine armies. Not having a detachment rule that makes them scarier is maybe a little bit unfortunate for them, though they definitely should be on theme. In any case, going to leave that one there for now. Look forward to hearing any thoughts from seasoned Alpha Legion generals down in the comments below. How do you marshal your forces of the Hydra? If you'd like to watch something else Chaos Space Marine, I'll leave a link to my Codex review down in the video description. Feel free to check that out if you'd like to see a bit of a talk through the units. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more like this. I do tend to post new videos most days. Finally, I'd just like to mention the channel's Patreon page if you'd like to help support the channel and keep these videos coming. That's links down in the video description, and it's the main reason that I can continue to do this as my main thing on YouTube, so a massive thank you for any of you folks choosing to support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.